So I have the challenge of providing an overview of global food trends in, as Jackie said, in 10 minutes, which is a bit daunting, but I picked 7 that I would like to highlight very briefly. And I will just jump right in with the first one. This year, it's unavoidable that we talk about shocks, and COVID-19, of course, being the prime example. Shocks will become increasingly important in the next several decades. And COVID-19 is a very illuminating example. It originates in the food system, has had tremendous impacts on the food system, although very diverse in different parts of it. Less so in primary production, much more so in processing and some retail areas and in restaurants and food service and so forth. But not only COVID-19, some of the other, quote, more routine things, droughts, floods, market shocks, and so forth, remain important, will continue to be important, and in some cases will become increasingly important in the future. While this is true, I will spend most of my time today talking about longer term changes. Now, these have rightly receded this year as we've focused attention on COVID and addressing its impacts and so forth, but they remain important and they will become more evident again once the current crisis eases. Population is a long-standing concern, but while that has traditionally focused on population growth, it's now becoming more diverse. Population will continue to grow in sub-Saharan Africa throughout this century, but in other regions in South Asia, that growth is slowing. In East Asia, populations will actually start to decline in the near future, and those bring different types of challenges with aging, with declining workforces to support them, and so forth. Income is another critical long-term driver of change in food systems. Incomes have suffered a setback this year due to the COVID crisis, but are still projected to rise in all regions, but from different levels and at different rates. And those then also imply changes, particularly in the nature of demand for food. And another factor is changes in technology throughout the food system, in primary production, in processing, in transportation, in energy use, in water use, and so forth. Solving some problems, raising new opportunities, raising new challenges as well. Has to do with production, which will be increasingly challenged by resource constraints, particularly in the case of climate and water, I would say. And I'll focus just briefly on climate change. On the right here, you see projections of how temperature may change later over the course of this century under different emissions pathways. But what's striking is the magnitude of those potential changes. Temperatures, global average temperatures so far over the past century and a half since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution have risen by about 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius. What's striking, though, is that that pattern actually goes much farther back than the past century and a half. In fact, the last 10,000 years, which is the entire history of human domestication of plants and animals, temperatures, global average temperatures have been in the range of about 1 degree Celsius, plus or minus. And so as we move into the middle part of this century and beyond, we really are moving into a unprecedented area in terms of human experience with agriculture. Fourth trend I'll highlight has to do with the important role of demand, which I think will increasingly play a driving role in the evolution of food systems. And that will be characterized increasingly by a shift towards higher value foods. And that reflects the changes in income that I showed in an earlier slide, as well as growth in population, globalization, changes in preferences, and so forth. So that will be characterized by increase in per capita demand for high nutrient foods like meat, fruits, and vegetables, all of which have a mix of nutritional benefits as well as, in some cases, environmental costs associated with production practices, but also changes in consumption of processed foods. There again, you have pros and cons. In some cases, processing improvements in packaging, transportation, food safety, and so forth, improve access to fresh produce and nutritious foods, but they also in some cases are associated with higher content of salt, sugar, and fat, which bring different types of health concerns. and also changes in patterns of consumption of food away from home. Because of the importance of demand, I wanted to spend a little bit more time on some of these patterns. These two panels show on the vertical axis the share of food expenditures, the share of total expenditures that are spent on food in different countries. The horizontal axis shows how that varies by per capita income. So in the left-hand panel, we see a snapshot. Sorry, the labels are quite small, but it's a snapshot of countries today, how they vary by income. And on the left, you see poorer countries spending typically 20, 30, 40% or more of their total expenditures on food, and that falls very sharply in richer countries. On the right-hand side, we see projections from IFPRI about how some of those countries may change over time out to middle of the century, and it's a very consistent pattern of a decline in the share of total expenditures that are spent on food. Similar relationship in terms of the share of calories that come from staple foods. On the left, you see it's higher in poorer countries today than it is in richer countries. And on the right, you see decline in most countries, although with not quite the same consistency and pattern as we saw for expenditures. The result of these trends is overall, and this is a global picture, increase in demand for different types of foods that varies across those different food groups. The bottom line here, you see projected population growth by an increase of about 1/3 between 2010 and the middle of this century. Cereals demand will increase slightly more rapidly, meat, dairy, and eggs even more so. And the highest, according to our projections, has to do with demand for fruits and vegetables, which is an encouraging sign in terms of their nutritional benefits. But those patterns vary by region. Here we see a comparison for 3 different regions. In each case, a comparison of the share of calories coming from different food groups in 2010 and how those are projected to change in 2030 and 2050. In North America, one is struck by the fact that already more than half of per capita daily calories are coming from fruits, vegetables, meat, dairy, and eggs. And there really isn't much change projected in that over the next several decades. Whereas in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, a larger share to begin with is accounted for by staples, but the growth is much more rapid in the other 2 categories, in fruits and vegetables and in meat, dairy, and eggs. And so for fruits and vegetables, for example, in South Asia, IFPRI projects more than a tripling of per capita daily consumption of those food items over the next several decades. Has to do with markets and a continued trend towards increasing interconnectedness at various scales. Now, this has been a long-standing trend. It is an uneven trend, and I would say has been set back in recent years by deglobalization, but that doesn't counter the long-term trend that is driven by improvements in information technology and reducing costs of transportation technology, which really makes markets much more globally a competitive environment. And that's also true at other scales as well. You see the expansion of supermarkets, increase in online shopping and delivery services, particularly accelerated in some countries in the current COVID environment. And those have triggered changes that will have longer lasting impacts as well. My 6th trend that I'd highlight is just that innovation will be driven increasingly by the private sector. And public R&D has played a critical role in recent years. Private R&D has as well, but I'm struck, for example, by a figure that I saw recently. I work for the International Food Policy Research Institute, which is one of the 15 CGIAR research centers. The combined budget of the CGIAR in 2020 is a little under $1 billion US, and that's for plant breeding, agronomy, policy work, gender work, nutrition, etc. A little under $1 billion globally. I read recently that the private on research just for alternative proteins was about the same. It was nearly $1 billion in the first quarter of 2020. So it just is an indication of the magnitude and the pace of change driven by demand, driven by market incentives and interconnectedness, driven by the private sector and the importance of that. But that brings me then to my final point, which is that there remains a really important scope and a need for policy work to focus on the things that may not be sufficiently addressed by private sector incentives and research. And that has to do with a whole range of issues relating to nutrition, to health, to environmental quality, critically to equity dimensions of food systems, and on the research that's needed to address all of these challenges better. And that brings me back finally to my first point, which was on shocks and the lessons that we can learn from our experience with dealing with COVID-19 this year. And I'm struck by the fact that by what is possible when there is the political will, when there's a social will, when countries work together with the private sector, what can be accomplished in a remarkably short time. But I'm also sobered by the difficulty of those challenges, even when the consequences are so immediate, so direct, so individually felt. How much bigger the challenge is for some of these long-term things like climate change, where the costs maybe of addressing them may be upfront, the benefits are much farther in the future and more diffuse. And to me, that just signals the critical importance of research to explore space we have to choose options from in the present. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Keith. That was a very nice overview, and your 7 points really on point, if I could use that term. But could I ask you something about foresighting? Climate change is not shocks. Well, some of it is shocks, events, but there's this long ongoing climate change issue that we're facing. How do you think that will affect our ability to meet the needs of both a global hungry population, but also that population that requires good nutrition?
It's a daunting challenge. As mentioned, we're venturing into a range of temperatures that exceed not only our recent experience, but human historical experience in terms of agriculture. The impacts will be very diverse. They'll vary by region, they'll vary over time, they vary by commodities. Some will benefit in some regions from milder temperatures, longer growing seasons. In other cases, they will be adversely affected. And the signal for temperature increase is a lot more consistent than it is for precipitation. So there's a lot of uncertainty about this as well. The models that we work with looking forward tend to focus on the impacts of changes in trends in these variables. So we're capturing some important indicators. What we're really missing so far the extreme events, the droughts and the floods and the hurricanes, which both can involve loss of crops, loss of animals, but changes in pest and disease patterns, changes in infrastructure that allow access to markets and so forth. So far, what we're seeing from the models, not only the ones that we work with in the CGIAR, but with other research centers around the world, that out to mid-century or so, the projections we see for improvements in technology and productivity outweigh the losses that are anticipated from climate change. But that balance is likely to shift later in the century. And that really highlights the importance of the research, because the things, the improvements of drought tolerance and heat tolerance and resistance to pests and diseases and so forth. Those are things that take 5, 10, 15 years to get, from the lab into the field, into farmers' fields and so forth. And so we really need to be investing today, not for the conditions of today, but for the conditions that we anticipate a decade or 2 decades into the future.